What are you drinking?
I've got some tea here.
Oh yeah, I'm a coffee guy
What?
myself.
Coffee? What
Yeah.
I've started to do is forget about tea. I just put ground ginger in there and then pour the hot water on it, add lemon, and it's good for the stomach and stuff like that.
Yeah, for sure. Mine is just I need to stay awake because I'm so tired all the time. I got this just
Minnesota,
massive,
man. Is it
massive
starting to get
mug.
cold? Is it starting to get cold already?
No, not yet. It's
Not yet.
still
Okay.
pretty warm. Um, except when it rains. When it rains, it starts to get really cold. Blocks out the
Have
sun.
you uh, have you encountered what they call Minnesota nice?
Probably. I'm not sure. I'm not. I'm more of an introvert. Kind of stay inside and don't speak much. So.
Everybody there's like the movie Fargo, real sweet, nice.
Yeah, well, yeah. Until recently, now we have like a bunch of rioting and stuff more recently.
Rioting, really? Oh, that's true. Minnesota, yeah, they got it too. Oh my, oh my. I hope we calm down.
All right,
Just
it looks like we are live. We've got some people in the audience say cool beans. I don't know if that's a response to the question, but it seems like we're good. So, Dr. Markos, thanks for coming on and taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
great. My name's Lou Markos, and I'm a professor of English and scholar in residence at Houston Baptist University. And I've been teaching here since 1991. I'm actually starting my 30th year. Obviously, I began teaching at the age of 17, Tom. And my specialties are romantic and Victorian poetry, but I also specialize in ancient Greece and Rome and C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. So I do a lot of books on apologetics and sort of Christianity and education and the classics, and very involved in what they call the classical Christian movement that tries to bring back not only Christianity, but the whole Western canon, beginning with Homer. So I'm always looking for links and learning from even from pagan literature. I've got a book coming out soon called The Myth Made Fact, reading Greek and Roman mythology through Christian eyes. So I like to make connections. I'm a synthetic thinker that like to bring together, and I always like to think of Christianity not as the only truth, but as the only complete truth. And that we talk about that, we'll see today. But I like to see the things that point forward rather than always dropping a wall. I like to make it a ladder, if you will.
Sure, that makes sense to me. Follow the evidence wherever it leads. I've seen a few of your videos on the atheist movement. Like, you're kind of critical of it a little bit, just a little bit. I'm an atheist, by which I mean I believe there are no reasons to believe in a God. I think that naturalism better explains everything about reality. Could you tell me the reasons you believe or indicate Christianity, and I can tell you my thoughts on those reasons and hear your thoughts on my position?
Great. Well, Tom, at first I was thinking, oh, let's go for the science. Let's talk about the Big Bang and the fine tuning of the universe and the DNA and the irreducible complexity. But the more I thought about it, I really thought that today what I'd like to do, instead of looking for God's fingerprint in the sort of macrocosm or the microcosm, I'd like to bring this down a sort of friendly conversation about what it means to be human, the mystery of man. And so I want to look at places that we don't think to look at because they're so obvious. We sort of take them for granted. So the first thing I'd like us to talk about, and as we follow wherever it leads, kind of what Socrates said, is just something that sounds like it should be meaningless, but I think it's very meaningful. And I ask this question: why is it that we, human beings, why is it that we are continually surprised by the passage of time? We see someone we haven't seen in 20 years and we say, my, how you've grown, as if they were going to stay a midget forever. We're continuing, and it's not just vanity. I don't really feel any different than I did when I was 25. And it's not vanity. It's just what's going on. Time should not have this bondage on us. Why is it? Why do we continually resist the holding, the clutching of time? Why do we think it should have nothing to do with us? And that feeling, I would argue, crosses everything, whatever sex, race, creed, culture, religion, whatever. I think we all feel it. We all struggle with it. We don't understand it. And the thing about it, Tom, is that we never stop and ask what that means. I don't think we ever see how strange it is that we're continually surprised by the passage of time. It's strange because time is the element in which we live. Or since we're fellow nerds, I'll quote the villain of Star Trek Generations, time is the fire in which we burn. Well, C.S. Lewis made an interesting analogy here, and he said, this fact that we are continually surprised by the passage of time would be like a fish being continually surprised by the wetness of water. Now, that would be a strange thing indeed, because water is the element in which a fish lives, just like time. We've never known anything but past, present, and future, just like the fish has never known anything but water. But if the fish were to be continually surprised by the wetness of water, that would be a strange thing indeed, unless that fish were destined someday to be a land animal. What I'm saying is that we were not made for time. We were made for eternity. And that's why we're never quite comfortable in time. Now, this is a beginning argument, Tom. This is not going to immediately say, the God of the Bible. But what this is offering and suggesting from our own personal experience, whatever our background is, that there is something beyond the natural, material, physical world. Where do we get this intimation and yearning for eternity unless there is something outside time and space? And that's, after all, what God means. Not gods, but God who is outside time and space. What do you think about that, Tom? How do you deal with that oddness of our humanity?
There's a couple of things. One would be, would there not be time and eternity? Like, wouldn't we still experience time and eternity?
I think it's possible. That's something that theologians have been debating about all the way back to Augustine, and William Lane Craig, who teaches at my school, has been arguing about that as well. And it could possibly be that, the biblical idea is that at the end, everything will be restored and perfected. Maybe time itself will be perfected. I mean, the closest intimation we have of eternity is the moment in which we live. But again, where does this come from? I really feel like our modern world, just in general, we've given up on looking for final causes. All we want are what Aristotle would call that sort of efficient, mechanical, direct cause and effect. But is there a deeper origin? How can a concept of eternity come out of a concept of time? What is the origin of it? I think it makes a lot more sense that time, to a certain extent, is a falling away from eternity. Where does that intimation come from? Why do we yearn for eternity when we don't know anything except time?
To answer your original question, the reason we have a surprise about time passing would just be induction. We experience some things regularly, but some things irregularly. And so when there's a change in the irregular things, we notice it. When usually it's the same things that don't change that we don't notice. So we don't change. We aren't surprised by all things in time, only the things that are strange in time. Like you said, you've grown so much, for example. That would be a change that we did not expect because we got locked into the changes that we do expect. So I don't think we're really surprised by time all that much. We're surprised by changes that we didn't expect that happen in time that we just didn't perceive as happening. But I don't think anyone's really surprised by time. That part I'm not really sure I would agree with. But to answer your second question, I don't think that time is a extension or I forget what you said, a breaking off of eternity. I think like any more than a water drop that is a breaking off of the ocean or whatever. It's just more of the same stuff. I think that time is, as a philosophical concept, just whatever is changing. If there's time is change essentially. And so if there is no time, there is no change. But other than that, I just see time and the physical concept is just a physical thing that exists in the universe, curvature of space-time. So it kind of depends on which kind of time too. So, but yeah, to your first question, I don't think we are particularly surprised by time. We're surprised by physical changes in time.
It comes back to a kind of a very old debate. You might see this as a sort of debate between Descartes and Locke, right? And this is the idea of we are finite beings. And as finite beings, how is it that we have a concept of infinity inside of us? And Locke tried to sort of do away with that argument by saying, well, we just take the finite numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way on up, and we just extend them forever to come up with the idea of infinitude. But I think there's a problem there. And the problem is that the difference between finity and infinity, sort of like the difference between time and eternity, is not a qualitative difference, is not a quantitative difference, but a qualitative difference. Infinity is not just keep going. Eternity is not just the timeline going on forever, though I think a lot of people think that. Even people that grew up in the church have the idea that eternity is just time going on forever. But it's no time. It's something that transcends time. It is something that is, the closest, I guess, we can imagine is a perpetual present. And so I don't think that Locke has answered that question of origins, that the greater, that the lesser can't create the greater, that our idea of finitude is not going to go boo, 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 and all of a sudden it's infinity. That's kind of Freud's idea, that our subconscious, which is material and dark and natural, can somehow sublimate itself and all of a sudden become the conscious mind. But, water doesn't rise above its source. I mean, I really think that across the board in our modern thinking, since the Enlightenment, I mean, not since the Renaissance, but since the Enlightenment, is this idea that the greater can come out of the lesser, but that's not how reality works. Infinitude is, again, qualitatively different. It's something other than finitude.
I'm not sure what you mean by that, because I understand infinity to just be the accumulation of individual units, like in mathematics. Infinity is just an uncountable set, essentially. So I don't see it as like some kind of ontologically or qualitatively different kind of a thing. It is just the quantitative addition of individuals. So I don't know what it means to say it is something beyond that. Could you explain that more?
Maybe another analogy to use is, okay, the fact that we get hungry proves, or at least strongly suggests, that we are creatures made for eating. The fact that we get thirsty seems to prove that we are creatures made for drinking, unless you're a Southern Baptist like me. That again, where does the hunger come from if there isn't a satisfaction for that hunger? Now, the desire itself doesn't prove you're going to get it, right? If I'm stranded in the middle of the desert, I am really, really yearning for water, but if it's not there, I'm going to die. But the desire suggests that there's a fulfillment of the desire. And I would argue that all of us have a yearning. Sometimes we kind of dampen it down as we get older, but from our childhood, we have a yearning for something that is supernatural or metaphysical. A yearning, today we would call it a yearning for transcendence, something that goes beyond. But again, what is the origin of that? Well, I think we're too quick to just think that it can just happen. This idea that consciousness is an epiphenomenon, that our brain gets bigger and bigger and suddenly we're conscious. Well, Tom, I'll admit, maybe if suddenly computers actually literally become conscious, that would be a pretty strong argument for atheism. But so far, we don't see that. So far, it is programming. So, I mean, I guess we can hold that out as a sort of test. But again, what is the origin? How can unconscious nature create consciousness? How can deterministic nature create free will? How can this happen? If naturalism, materialism, if it's true, then all there is nature. So how can nature create in us a yearning for something outside of nature? Right? Nature, first of all, nature is not a conscious being. We always talk about nature or just luck or chance or whatever, but these are not real things. In that sense, gravity, there's no such thing as gravity unless you have matter that's moving around. So again, I'm coming back to origin. Where does that yearning come from? Where does it come from? How can nature create a yearning for something it knows nothing about?
Well, I mean, we do that all the time. Like, it's just a combination of other things we do know about, like any idea in our head. For example, people want to have their cake and eat it too, kind of a thing. Like, we can definitely have ideas where you can produce logical contradictions or things that don't exist in reality. I want to pet a unicorn or ride a unicorn. I want to fly like Superman or go Lord of the Rings, go live in Lord of the Rings. There's all kinds of ideas and yearnings we have for things that don't exist and aren't real beyond just the supernatural and the natural, but also fantasy and fiction and other categories of reality that aren't supernatural, natural, ubernatural, the unknown natural. There's all kinds of things that we have desires for, and it's all just a combination of other ideas that we do have, just like anything in our heads. Just we take something we can relate with, like existence and time, and we say, well, this could exist outside of the physical. It's sort of like water can exist outside of a cup. And then we take that analogy and apply it to an idea, and we get the yearning to see that take place. So it just seems to be the natural process of the mind essentially working as it normally does to form ideas. I don't see that as being indicative of there being a supernatural any more than I see the desire to have a cake and eat it too as the possibility that it's logically possible to have a cake while you also eat it at the same time, which I don't think is possible because it's a logical contradiction. So I don't see that as being evidence of the supernatural in just because we desire it.
I do see some truth there, but again, when we're talking, say, about a unicorn, we're taking things we know and recombining them, which is something our mind does. But I'm talking about a yearning for something that is wholly other. Kind of the way I feel if we are merely the product of some kind of natural selection, survival of the fittest, then why is there inside us a sort of deep disgust for that? In other words, how is it that we can come to have a sort of disgust or repulsion towards the very thing that made us or created us? So I'm not just talking about a recombination of things. I'm talking about something that's wholly. Here's another way maybe to put it. Again, this quantitative, qualitative idea is, where does our religious sense come from? And many people will say, well, it's the fear of the unknown. And again, Lewis talks about this in a book he wrote called The Problem of Pain. If I tell you on the other side of that door is a tiger, you're going to be afraid. If I tell you on the other side of that door there's a ghost, we might be afraid. And we use the same word, fear, but it is a qualitatively different kind of fear. We fear the wild animal because it can kill us, but the ghost cannot hurt us. This is a different kind of fear, something that, I mean, obviously I can't prove this, but that certainly we don't see in the animal kingdom. A kind of fear of the numinous, of something that is beyond. Why are human beings the only animals that are afraid of our own graveyards? What's going on, right? When Tarzan is on top of the elephant and they're going into the graveyard of the elephants looking for ivory, Tarzan feels that, that sort of numinous fear of the unknown. But the elephant is not, I'm afraid. The elephant just marches in there. So we are coming back again to this idea that there are quantitative things, a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, but then there are things that are wholly other, a qualitative leap that is not really involved in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's something wholly other.
I'd like to definitely ask for. I'd definitely like to ask for clarification on that. Like the fear of graveyards, actually, most social mammals feel that. It's any smell of death or anything that resembles the ending of life. Most animals are afraid of is similar to humans. We just made it into a visual representation instead of just smell and sight and things. So most animals are actually afraid of common graveyard places where animals go to die of their kind. But you keep mentioning the wholly other idea. I wanted to ask about that because from my perspective, the supernatural isn't wholly other. It's just a combination of things we know of, and you just put them in a way to a new combination that we just haven't seen. So like a unicorn. A unicorn is a horse that's pink with a horn or whatever. The supernatural seems to be the same thing, where you take the properties of the natural world, like we exist, we can talk with one another, we can spend time and do things we enjoy, and then you just take out the negative consequences like death and pain and suffering, and you just get the supernatural realm that we desire, essentially, which you can do perfectly naturally too. Like we could, if we had enough control over physics, we could do it in nature, and so we can have those same kinds of yearnings purely about the natural world as we do for the supernatural world, it doesn't seem like that's wholly other. It just seems like it's a combination of things like the unicorn.
I see that, but there seems to be something in us that can step outside of nature. Ultimately, our reason that steps out of nature and sees nature and looks at it. Our reason can even change nature to a certain extent. Where
What do you mean by
again,
that?
we're talking about origin here. Why? I mean, again, when we think of something like naturalism or materialism or atheism, any kind of system, we're arriving at that system by the use of our reason. But the fact that we trust our reason rests on a kind of faith, that there is a rational order outside of us and that we have reason, that there's some kind of link between our reason inside of our head and this wider, greater reason around us. In other words, one of the problems of a naturalistic system is that it undercuts the very reason that has created it. We're looking at things that transcend the natural world, that nature knows nothing about. Our reason is above. This is, again, Lewis made this famous phrase, naturalism is self-refuting, by which he meant that naturalism is based on our rational assessment of the world. But if naturalism is true, then our reason is just based on sort of random arbitrary firing. And how can we then trust it? So again, we're pointing to something in us that is beyond, and not just more than, but that steps outside. What I'm trying to find, I guess, is that naturalism, atheism, materialism ultimately puts us in a closed world. Is there any evidence that we can find? And I'm not even quoting the Bible. I obviously believe in the Bible, but I'm trying to find common ground here of evidence, even in our own experience, that there is something that transcends this world, and not just in a fairy tale way, but evidence that there is something outside this world, outside time and space, not just up there, but outside.
Sure. I'm still, because I still see that you keep mentioning that it's outside of, but I don't see how that's the case. What is it exactly that's not just a combination of other things? And you said reason, but reason, as far as I understand it, is a product of our minds. It's not, it doesn't exist outside of the natural world. It's something that our minds do. I mean, to say that because our minds are a product of random firings, therefore they're unreliable, would just be a genetic fallacy. Like, you can't say the source of something makes it unreliable. For example, if I shake a magic 8 ball and it says the lottery numbers or whatever, the fact that I got the source from a magic 8 ball doesn't prove it wrong. It's just, we know that that source is wrong because it has an unreliable history. So if we can show it has a reliable history, then that's justification to believe it. So in the case of reason, we start with the I think, therefore I am. I have this quality experience I'm having, and my ideas don't seem to affect the world I'm perceiving with my senses. So if I want to say something exists in that world I'm perceiving, then I'd have to show that it's not just something in my head. I have an idea that what knocked over that cup, maybe it's a squirrel, a bird, whatever. Then I can say, if it's a squirrel, then I can predict that if we will see squirrel droppings around the cup or whatever. And so that prediction, if it's true, if we can then verify it in the future, indicates that that idea wasn't just something in my head. It corresponds to what's going on in the external world, independent of what's going on in my head. And reason is just that process of a language we come up with in our mind to describe what we're experiencing and the difference between that and our imagination. So it just seems to be a language. Math and logic are just languages humans made up, essentially, to describe reality. And it's really reality that's fundamental. It's not the reason isn't outside of our natural world.
And yet, why does the correspondence work?
Well, it doesn't.
See, why does it work? In other words, there seems to be a link between the thoughts, the mind, reason, logic. I mean, as others have said, one of the criteria for a new formula in mathematics is elegance. The more elegant and simple it is, the more chance it has of being true. But why? If we're in a random universe, why would the more elegant and simple thing be true?
Oh, well, there isn't a correspondence. For example, math and logic are a language just like English. So, for example, there's sentences that correspond to reality. 1 + 1 = 2. I am a human. There are sentences that do not correspond to reality, like F equals ma times 32, or just like I am a space leprechaun. So there's sentences that do and don't, and there's sentences that are self-contradictory. 1 + 1 = 7, or I am a married bachelor. So there's infinitely many sentences, both in math and English and logic, that do correspond to reality, that don't correspond to reality, and that are self-contradictory. The fact that we focus on the ones that do correspond to reality is the same reason we focus on them in English. It's because they're more useful in certain contexts. But there's no special unreasonable effectiveness in that sense. It's just we find the ones that correspond to reality and we use those to make more patterns that seem to correspond to reality. Just like I can make a sentence that says, that is a rock. That rock is on a hill. The rock is on a hill, which is on another hill, or whatever. So you can obviously build more reliable sentences off of the previous sentences that are correspondent to reality. So it's not really that there's a special kind of feature to it. It's just a language that we use. And what was the second thing you mentioned?
Well, I forgot. But again, the fact that it is a language, I think, is important. I mean, as we've discovered over the years, our DNA is a language that's front loaded with information. It's, again, I like the way a lot of modern apologists talk about it, that when you go to a crime scene and there's a murder and it's in a sealed room. And one of the questions that the detectives are going to ask is, can everything that happened in this room be explained by this room? Or does there need to be something from outside? In other words, could it be a suicide, whatever? Can everything in this box explain what we've seen here? But if there is evidence in that box that points outside of it, that demands an outside intruder of some kind. And so what we're looking for, people nowadays call it abduction. It is argument to the best explanation. What best explains it? Because there's a difference between data and the interpretation of data. And a good example of that is what the evolutionists call homology, right? That my arm has a similar structure to a bat wing or a dorsal fin of a dolphin, that sort of stuff. What does it mean? And one explanation is somehow a kind of evolutionary explanation. But that same evidence also points, and I would argue it points more clearly, towards a common designer who is not reinventing the wheel every 5 seconds, but using it. I read people like Jared Diamond who show that there are adaptation strategies in ants or birds that disappear and don't appear until man again. And it's like, so nature just forgets those things? Or is it that every species has an adaptation strategy and some of those adaptation strategies are reused? So I'm saying that I think this evidence, again, for a reason, like I said, for our desires, for our yearnings, even for our perception of eternity or infinity, I think it's still better explained by an outside force rather than saying that everything in this room, this little box like we're inside of in this interview, that somehow is fully explanatory. That, oh, I guess water can rise above its surface, and that the lesser can create the greater, that unconscious nature can create conscious mind, that even our perception of beauty comes out of it. And again, that's really, I think a lot of people misunderstand Freud. I think they think that Freud thinks our conscious mind is primary and our subconscious mind is secondary, but he actually believes the opposite. He's basically taking Darwin and finding a way to, quote, evolve the soul. That
He was
in the
he was
beginning,
unconscious mind, right? Freud was unconscious and conscious.
yeah, unconscious, yeah. That somehow this subconscious is Jung, but that he really thought that the unconscious was primary and that somehow created the conscious mind by what he called sublimation. But is that really the way that nature works? Again, it is water rising above its source. We have this strange data, and how do we account for it? Again, reason, even religion itself It's really the funny thing is that um, is a lot of people argue against, particularly the God of the Bible, by saying, "Look at all the injustice there is in the world." To which I would respond, "Well, if there's no God, how do you know the world is unjust? Because without a God, there is no standard of justice. There is just survival of the fittest." And so where is that coming from? Where is our rage coming from? I guess I just don't believe that anybody looking around at a world with death and destruction would invent a good and loving God. It makes more sense the other way around, that we have that inbuilt perception of that God, that loving God, and how do we square it with the world? But there would be no problem of pain if there were no God. We shouldn't be upset about pain and justice and people dying young, because that's what nature is if there's nothing outside of nature.
Sure. Well, I just to note, I'm a moral realist, like most philosophers. So even though most philosophers are atheists, they also believe in objective morality. So there's lots of different models of objective morality without a God. But there's a few things I wanted to touch on. Was the crime scene one was first. So in a crime scene, both in crime scene investigation, forensics, and the courtroom, you're only allowed to appeal things that we already have evidence for, things we have precedents for. So if you want to say, well, what killed that guy, that body over there? Well, you can say it was a guy with a gun, but you couldn't say it was an alien or a unicorn or the supernatural or ghost. Those would never be options because there's no precedence for them. We have no no evidence of them existing prior to this case. So the only reasonable explanations of the event would be things we already have evidence for. So like if we saw a footprint in the snow, we can say it was a horse or a zebra maybe, but we couldn't say it was a unicorn. And so in history and forensics, it's never reasonable to infer miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, supernatural, UFOs, anything that doesn't already have an empirical basis, because it doesn't have precedence. The same thing with abduction. Abduction cannot indicate those things either. Abduction was introduced to philosophy from Charles Peirce, and he said that induction or abduction was the same structure as affirming the consequent fallacy. It's the same essential structure. And so it's only good for coming up with a hypothesis, but the hypothesis needs to be independently testable from the abduction, or it's not confirmed. So I agree, abduction is a great way to come up with a hypothesis, but you can't justify the conclusion based off of the abduction. You need some independent testable variable, as Charles S. Peirce said. So again, evil, I'm a moral realist, so I believe in objective morality, and I think that's emergent, higher order emergent property. It exists in the world, kind of like fitness does. It's like fitness is the feature that certain species will survive in more environments than other species, and that's just an objective fact of the ability to survive. Morality is describing the ability for certain beings to interact in certain environments, the same kind of a way fitness is. So I think it definitely exists objectively without a God. It's just a feature of the world. And I don't think morality works as being objective by God. I think that makes it subjective. Like if it's dependent on God, well, then it's contingent on a mind, which makes it by definition subjective. Euthyphro dilemma, classical Euthyphro dilemma.
But we're more than a mind. I mean, we're talking about absolute self-consciousness. I mean, we're talking about God. We're talking about the I am that I am. But what you say about abduction, and I certainly acknowledge that. So why is it that when we look at the evidence of the Big Bang, God is unacceptable, but multiverses, which is science fiction, is somehow acceptable, but God isn't?
The multiverse is a combination of known physics. So it's a combination of the equations of early universe inflation from Guth and energy states in space, which was done with this experiment with two really close metal bars and showed that they would touch in space under certain conditions. So it combines the energy states of space with the mathematics used in the energy states of space with the mathematics used for the early universe inflation. So it's just combining things we already have empirical evidence for. Both of those are confirmed empirically. And then if you put those together, you get a result of the multiverse. So it's not that the multiverse is just a priori fine to assert, it's that it's a combination of things we already have evidence for. And God, of course, would not be, because there's lots of properties in God that we do not have empirical verification for, depending on what your definition of God is.
So what would be sufficient proof?
Novel testable predictions. So any new thing that we don't know exists, you would have to say, I'm adding in this new property like magic or whatever. If magic exists, then if you cast a spell, you will see a gold brick will appear in front of me or something. And if you can do that reliably and testably and repeatably, then that would be good evidence for whatever your hypothesis is. So if I say a God exists, and if I pray to a God, a gold brick appears in front of me, and every time I pray, a gold brick appears, that would be good evidence of a God, because it can make a novel testable prediction that no other hypothesis was able to make yet. You were first, you get the evidence kind of a thing. And that applies to any new novel thing that we just don't know about yet. Like, so in physics, you take a combination of all the stuff we know about, add in a new thing like the multiverse, and then if you want to confirm the multiverse, you need to make testable predictions. But the reason it's not really accepted in physics right now is because it hasn't made testable predictions. Same with all the different interpretations of quantum mechanics. So if you add anything new, you need testable predictions to confirm it.
But what if that, okay, with the Big Bang, it demands whatever, a banger, some kind of beginning, and it demands something that is complete, that is outside of time and space, and that ultimately in some way has its existence in itself. And when science is seeking something, and then we find that same testimony in the great theologians like Augustine, and only there, because remember, the gods, when we speak of the gods, they all have genealogies, right? They all came out of the chaos. Only the God of the Bible has no genealogy. He simply is. He is I am that I am. And when suddenly a scientific discovery, or a bunch of scientific discoveries, push us to look for some kind of origin that, again, has its existence in its essence, that is outside of time and space, and then I think that we can make that connection and suggest maybe there is an overlap here. If this testimony made by people who didn't know modern physics, whatever, is suddenly lining up there.
What do you mean by testimony there?
We should look at.
You said the testimony of these people. What do you mean? Just the claim that it had a beginning?
Well, just from the Bible itself to Augustine's discussion of it, to the theologians and whatnot who are understanding, to God's self-revelation of himself as I am that I am. In the beginning was the Word. All of this stuff, if it lines up with what we're seeing in physics, and there's no way that those people could have seen where physics was going. There is, again, I'm not saying it proves 100%, but it suggests that this might be a answer or a cause that's worth considering, at least.
Oh, I
because
agree.
they're overlapping.
For sure, absolutely.
In the same way that.
So I just want to say, yeah, I mean, I totally agree. As a hypothesis, definitely, we should definitely consider it as a hypothesis, just like any other hypothesis. But just like with abduction, you would need some additional testable prediction to confirm that hypothesis isn't just in your imagination, but also corresponds to something independent of your imagination in reality. So, but when you mentioned the other gods all having an origin, I mean, yeah, most gods were created by something prior to them, right. But in all of those religions, there is something prior to them that is not created. Like you have the chaos in Hinduism, Brahmin, right. and Jainism, all kinds of things that exist prior to the gods. And there is some fundamental thing there. So there always is one of those fundamental things in each one of these religions, as far as I know. And there's only really two possibilities. Either there is a fundamental thing or something came from nothing, which usually, I think every ideology goes with there's some fundamental thing.
Right.
But in the case of physics, the Big Bang says there's a beginning to the space-time as described in general and special relativity. So it's specifically the lambda symbol. So that's not the same as the philosophical concept of space-time. So when we say that the origin of the Big Bang is outside of space and time, that just means it's outside of the lambda symbol in general relativity, which is specifically just the curvature of space-time in our universe, which means there could absolutely just be other kinds of time of change independent of the entropy that we experience in the physical thing of space-time in our universe. So there isn't really a contradiction in saying there are other universes with other times outside of ours, because the beginning of space-time only refers to our universe, the specific kind of physical space-time in our universe. It's not a all space, all time, just our space and our time beginning. And so the context of physics, there's lots of different models that have things outside of space-time. Like you have Nima Arkani Hamad's amplituhedron, which is a kind of emergent spacetime where spacetime emerges from this underlying physical geometry, and Sean Carroll's emergent spacetime, same kind of a thing. So there are models in physics that do go outside of spacetime, in the sense that we're talking about outside of our known spacetime. But there's nothing in the Big Bang says it goes outside of all space and all time. It's only referent to the specific thing in physics represented by lambda in general and special relativity. I don't think that indicates the conclusion you're trying to justify.
I mean, I see that there are ultimately two paradigms: either in the beginning matter, in the beginning stuff, or in the beginning God. And everything outside the Bible, Plato gets close in Timaeus, but everything outside the Bible is in the beginning is stuff, matter, chaos. Now, Aristotle was kind of strange because he suggested maybe the universe and God were both eternal. But as you know, throughout much of the 20th century, even Einstein himself was resisting the Big Bang. They wanted steady state. They wanted the universe to be eternal because they know nothing comes out of nothing. And all of a sudden, we're moving towards an idea that's saying, at least our universe, if you want to suggest what you're saying there, has a beginning, that it's not eternal, that there needs to be something outside of it that has that eternal nature to it. And again, the Bible is completely unique because, one of the things I study is the ancient world and everything. Like you said, chaos. It's in the beginning. There's just stuff. There's chaos. Basically, is undistributed matter. And most of the pre-Socratics looked for the arche, the beginning thing. But usually it was earth, air, water, fire, one of those elements. But here is this idea that no, in the beginning there was God. I mean, that statement is shocking. And again, where does it come from? If not from direct revelation, it's outside of our ken, and it just wasn't said. I mean, of course, it's in Judaism and Christianity, and Islam is picking it up from the Bible, and deism is picking it up too, depending on what kind of a deist you are. But that this is just an amazing claim that in the beginning is God, that spirit is primary and not matter. And I would argue what happened in the Enlightenment, again, not the Renaissance, but in the Enlightenment, sometimes called the Enlightenment Project, is this idea that every single thing needs to be refounded on physical, natural, material processes. And so we start to work in that way. And now we've sort of gone to the other extreme. Now we can't accept anything but a natural, physical explanation. It makes me think, this is not something I'm arguing about, it's just as an analogy, that it used to be that any kind of mental problems, people said it must be spiritual, it must be a devil. And now we've gone to the opposite extreme. It has to be biochemical. And why can we no longer suggest there's some of both? And I want to get into that. But what I'm saying is that we've sort of pushed it to one end or the other. Either everything has to be founded on natural principles, or everything has to be founded on physical principles. And again, it's unique. The famous phrase is God created the world ex nihilo, out of nothing. That's a pretty astounding statement that seems strange until we get to modern physics. And again, just modern physics showing us these strange paradoxes. Have you ever had Hugh Ross on your?
Yes, I've debated him twice, I believe.
Oh, I wish he would come because he always fascinates me. And he's an interesting one. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh yeah. So you mentioned that there are essentially the two possibilities. Either it's just a mind of some kind, or just a material non-mind of some kind, or both. And that seems, you said Christianity was unique in that way. I'm not sure I would agree.
I should say Judaism, the Bible, really.
Right.
The Genesis.
The Abrahamic religions. So, yeah. But I don't see that to be the case, because there's many different religions that take all three of those different positions. Like the creation from chaos from the Greek, the Jasmid Korean, the Pangu, all kinds of religions take that position. And then there's the mind position, the Ainu, the Cherokee, Iroquois, Native American Indian ones take those positions. Then there's the emergent ones of the Hopi myth creation, the Maya creation, the Dain Bahini. I don't know how to pronounce that. There's all kinds that take all of those three positions. So I don't know what you mean when you say Christianity is unique in that it takes that God is the beginning. I mean, even Hinduism takes that Brahman, the mind of Brahman, was the beginning. So I don't know why that would be unique to Christianity.
That in the beginning there is only spirit. There is, in other words, God didn't just shape the matter, he created the matter. In other words, in the beginning, there is just God. And God is create. It's just like, it's fascinating with the Big Bang. A lot of people have this idea that there's space and the Big Bang filled it with matter. But in fact, the Big Bang is creating space and matter. All of it is coming out at the same time. And that's unique. I mean, I may be wrong about this, but all the things that I see in Native American Indian and whatnot, there still is matter there. The idea that there is only spirit in the beginning. There is not just, again, undistributed matter. That there is, I mean, the Greeks did, somebody like what was, the idea that there is mind, right? Nous, as they say in Greek, and there's matter, and the nous is trying to shape the matter. But this idea that God created the matter and then shaped it is a pretty amazing concept.
Sure, but I would
that
think of,
is unique.
well, I would think that like in the case of the Brahman example, where there is just Brahman and everything is a result of essentially his dream, like the entire universe, all
Right.
matter and thing was created from his dream. And so in a sense, he created everything and it was just him originally. Similarly, it seems that would apply just in the same way that you say that Christianity and the Abrahamic religions apply, whereas there is just God is in the beginning, just a mind, and then he created all matter. It seems like I could probably find a dozen or so religions that would all fit that same archetype.
I guess maybe the best way to explain this is, okay, do we focus on God's transcendence or God's immanence? So in Judaism and Islam, here is God, and God creates the world, and he is other than the world. In the more Eastern religions you're talking about, basically God is the world ultimately, right? It's not just polytheism, but it is pantheism. God is fully immanent. And in the Gita, when Krishna reveals himself to Arjuna, he basically shows him that he is everything. Okay, Brahman is Atman. Everything is one. So we have a radical pantheism, and pantheism was suggested in the West by Parmenides and later on even by Spinoza. But today we think of it more as an Eastern thing. But there were advocates of it in the West. So we've got those two paradigms: absolute transcendence or absolute immanence. And what makes Christianity unique is that it is obviously Abrahamic. So we do have a God who is transcendent and absolutely separate from his world, but that God entered into the world and became a man. So another easy way to put it is, if you ask a Jew or a Muslim or a deist maybe, was Jesus the Son of God? They would say, God has no son. Right? God is a wholly other. But if you ask a Hindu or a Hindu or a Buddhist, New Ager, quote, was Jesus the Son of God? They might say, well, yes, I believe that Jesus was the Son of God, but so was Gandhi, so was Buddha, so are all of us if we only know it. So this concept of Jesus being the only begotten Son of God, the one and only, is unique. We have a God that is completely transcendent and completely immanent at the same time. And ultimately, God is upholding all of the universe. He's separate from the universe, but he is, I think it was Lewis that said, he's the only energy on which the universe runs. But God is not to be confused with the universe. Just like in Christianity, Christians do not believe in the one soul, where our soul gets lost in the ocean. We will be one with God, but we will still be ourselves. And that's why the analogy used is the great marriage of Christ and the church. Husband and wife are one flesh, but they're still two people. They're not a monster with two heads. So we're getting at the ultimate mystery, which Christianity calls the incarnation. That we, as a human being, I'm not a soul trapped in a body, as Plato said, but I am an enfleshed soul, fully physical and fully spiritual. That's why, of course, if I get a brain injury, it's going to affect my consciousness, because I am a enfleshed soul. That's what Christian theology has always said. And in the same way, Jesus is fully divine and fully human, fully God and fully man. We're talking about this ultimate mystery, but that mystery is also not wholly other, because I think that mystery is written into the fabric of the universe, into marriage, into sexuality, into the pregnant mother who is one with her child and yet two. So I guess what I'm saying is, kind of going back to an earlier point, that it's not something that has no precedent, but maybe it's so deeply interwoven that we don't see it.
Sure, but it seems to apply to all monotheisms. Like even Zoroastrianism would have a single original God that would create everything. So it doesn't seem to be unique to Christianity in that sense. It just seems to be that the terminologies that you use, the transcendence and immanence, that would of course be unique to specific branches of Christianity. But I don't see anything about the story itself that seems unique. It just seems to be different preferred terminologies of a single kind of monotheistic God, as opposed to a pantheistic God or a polytheistic God or all different variations. I don't see that as being particularly special. And even if it was unique to Christianity, I don't see why that would indicate that it's true. Like we can say all these other variations are unique to their particular origin, certain features of, well, maybe this God was a part of the universe, or this God created the universe, or this God created the universe out of itself and destroyed itself in the process. Panentheism, panendeism, all the different panen versions of theism.
Right.
But even if they were all like one religion to each of them, that doesn't show that any one of them is more or less true than the others. Even if there's a whole bunch that take up one archetype of polytheism, that doesn't mean that any of those are less likely to be true than monotheism, even if there was only one monotheism. So I don't see why that would indicate Christianity, even if it were true.
I think that's interesting because what you say reminds me of a modern argument that's used on a lot of atheist websites. But I think it's one of the more strong arguments for Christianity, and it actually turns out to be one of the main arguments that led C.S. Lewis from just plain theism into Christianity. And I'm sure you're familiar with this, and it's on a lot of websites. That there was a book called The Golden Bough by Sir James Frazer, and he talked about this archetype that he called the corn god or the corn king. And as we look across cultures, we see these strange stories of a sort of God coming to earth and often dying some kind of, painful death, and yet being reborn each spring. A corn king because it's following the cycle of the corn or the wheat. The British use the word corn for wheat. It follows that cycle, right? So you've got in Egypt, you have Osiris, and in Persia, you have Mithras, and in Greece, you have Adonis or Bacchus, and you have Tammuz, and you have Balder, and to a certain extent, you have Krishna as well. And the story of Jesus, the incarnation, death, and resurrection of Christ, does sound an awful lot like this. But there's a big difference. All those mythical stories, beautiful as they are mythical in the sense that they're taking place in mythical time, that the importance of the story is not whether it's literally true, but the importance of the story is it is saying something, a yearning about the cycles of nature, the perception of life and death and rebirth. And then all of a sudden, we've got something happening in Palestine in the 1st century AD, and it sounds a whole lot like this, but there's a difference. This is something that's happening in time and space, right? Born under the emperorship of Caesar Augustus, crucified under the emperorship of Tiberius. It's happening. He's crucified under Pontius Pilate. And what's going on here? And again, this is why I said earlier that the phrase I like to use is Christianity is not the only truth, it's the only complete truth. Because obviously, if we're all created in the image of God, everybody's going to get bits and pieces of truth. But maybe only, and I don't want to say Christ, I would say only in Christ himself do we find truth in its absolute and perfect form. Because to me, religion is man reaching up to God and trying to figure things out, usually trying to build some kind of stairway, some kind of good works. And whether you're a Jew and you're doing good works in this life, or you're a Muslim, a Hindu, and you think you can have many lives, it's still trying to build a ladder to God. But what if there was one time when God himself actually entered human history? And we talk often, Christians often talk about how Jesus fulfills so many prophecies in the Old Testament. And that's an amazing thing. And I'll show you how amazing it is both Islam and Mormonism claim to have a new book that fulfilled, but even the greatest Mormons and Muslims can't show you any evidence in the New Testament that God is doing something else, right? But the Old Testament is filled with all these things. But my point is, he's not only fulfilling the law and the prophets of the Jews, the messianic prophecies, all those amazing things, Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22. I'm arguing that he also fulfilled the greatest yearnings of the pagan peoples. Because I don't know if this bothers you, Tom, but it always bothered me. So are you saying that God ignored 99% of the human population and only cared about the Jews until the coming of Christ? Well, the argument I'm making is he did speak to all people, but only to the Jews did he speak directly. We kind of forget how difficult it is to have direct revelation, but we all have that. What's a sensus divinitatis is the famous Latin word, a sense of the divine. We reach out, we grope. And I would argue that that finds its way into these very strange myths. Because, Tom, you know that no pagan people have a sense of sin as Christians and Jews know it, because the only way you can have a sense of sin is if you have a holy God to measure that sin against. And yet, the ancient people clearly, though they don't have sin in that theological way, understand what we call taboo, that there are certain crimes that bring a sort of uncleanness or whatever that is poisoning the community. And there's an understanding that there needs to be some kind of ritual cleansing. And what I'm saying is that the fact that Jesus looks like those things is actually more not proof that he's just a Hebrew myth, but that he is fulfilling in historical time and space with an actual resurrection from the dead what everybody yearned for. So it goes back to the yearning for eternity, the yearning for something beyond. That, yes, we can yearn for it, but if there really is a God, he's got to prove himself in a pretty direct way. And to me, if Jesus is who he said he is, this is God. That's a lot to say. I should turn it over to you, Tom.
Yeah, so all the dying and rising gods, yeah, I'm familiar with those. Richard Carrier talks about those a lot. He's a mythicist. Right. I'm not. I think Jesus definitely existed. But originally you said that monotheism was unique and that Christianity was unique and that it had an ultimate beginning for God. But then you mentioned how Jesus's trope was not unique and how there's lots of different similar stories to that. And you seem to be implying that both of those were kind of evidence or indicative of Christianity in some sense. Whereas I don't think either are. I don't think the number of ideas of a certain trope actually indicate the truth of the idea. Like, I'm sure people could come up with all kinds of unique ideas that wouldn't be evidence that they're true, and people could come up with all kind of well-known ideas or similar tropes, and that wouldn't be evidence that they are true. So I don't think the number of ideas one way or the other indicates the truth of a position at all. I think that, like you mentioned, if Jesus actually did predict he was going to rise from the dead and did rise from the dead, that would be pretty good evidence. Like I'd be pretty compelled by that because it's a future testable prediction. All future testable predictions are great evidence, but I don't see evidence to support that conclusion. So I don't think the number, either whether Christianity was unique or whether the Jesus story was not unique and that it fulfilled many different kinds of prophecies. I don't see either of those being indicative of Christianity. And you mentioned that Christianity is the complete truth. Like, what do you mean by complete truth? How do you assess which truth is complete versus incomplete?
Again, I do agree with you in one sense that numbers alone are not going to prove it. It's just when I see that same basic yearning for God, a yearning that is fulfilled in, God made flesh, crucified and resurrected. Why is it that spread across the globe we see a yearning like that? I'm just seeing that of evidence that the God who created all of us has put that yearning in us. And that's why we see that yearning manifesting itself in different ways, but a similar kind of yearning that's pointing towards that. So it's merely, I'm seeing a pointer, and I'm saying if, Jesus, if the dying, rising God suddenly does something that brings a completion. This is what I mean by the only complete truth. That, again, you probably know this, right? That everybody uses that analogy of the blind man and the elephant to prove relativism. But what they're forgetting is there is an elephant, okay? But each of them is only getting a small percentage of it, right? They're getting some truth, but they don't have the elephant. I guess I'm saying Christianity is the elephant coming into history and saying, this is who I am. And I like to just use the word Christ rather than Christianity because that sounds like the Western world and all that sort of stuff. I'm just talking about who Jesus is. Who is this person that made, and you're obviously familiar with what's called the liar, lunatic, Lord argument, is Jesus makes these claims. And again, this argument, okay, the argument basically is that Jesus makes these incredible claims to be equal with God, to be the Son of God, to have the power to forgive sins, the way, the truth, life, all of these things, right? And that argument I'm making doesn't rely on what Christians call inerrancy of Scripture, or even that Scripture is directly inspired by God. I'm just looking at them as historical documents, something like the lives that Plutarch wrote, almost the same time as the Gospels being written, that we have corroborating evidence that Jesus said these things. And what's interesting, Tom, is that Jesus's critics do not say Jesus didn't say that. His critics say Jesus said it, and that's proof that he's a blasphemer. Because you need to understand that if Jesus was not the Son of God, then he was indeed the worst blasphemer, and the Pharisees were correct to condemn him and turn him over to the Romans. So none of his enemies said he's just a good Jewish boy, just a prophet, just a rabbi, just a teacher. They themselves understood that either this man is crazy, his own family wanted to lock him up at one point, or he's the devil of hell, a blasphemer, or he is who he said he is. And the resurrection is important. It's that whole Popper thing of what's the word? Falsifiability. That Christianity is falsifiable, and you sort of alluded to that earlier. That if we have a body, it's falsifiable. But what happened to that body? And I'm sure you're aware that much of Christian apologetics, rightly I think, is focused on that. And what would a judge say if the evidence was presented? And what we see in the Gospels is evidence that corroborates. It doesn't. It's not like every gospel account is exactly the same. If it was, we would see collusion there. But it's also not wildly different. It's what a judge would accept with different eyewitness testimonies coming together. What happened to the body, right? And the only real good answer is that the disciples stole it. But if the disciples stole the body, then they died for what they knew was a hoax. And there's lots of people who will die for a delusion. But to die for something that you know is a hoax because you perpetrated the hoax, I think is something that needs some psychological investigation. I'm sorry, I said so many things. Jump in wherever you want.
Sure. So the yearning thing, the fact that we have yearning for like an afterlife or whatever, I don't see that as particularly a supernatural thing. We have a yearning for community and friends and family and fulfillment and achievement and all kinds of things. That all seems to be a result of evolution. So I don't see that as particularly surprising that we have this yearning for immortality or redemption of sins or moral judgment or whatever. I don't think that is particularly special. And I don't see that as, like you mentioned earlier, that sin was a unique concept. I also don't see that as necessarily true, even though the terminology is definitely unique.
Right.
I think the same kind of concept can be found in Buddhism with karma, or Jainism with all the different versions of what they see as morality and karma and right and wrong and all those kinds of things seem to exist independent of a God concept. Even like the Golden Rule originated from Hinduism. So I don't see that as particularly unique to Christianity. The liar, lunatic, or Lord thing, I think that's a strange phrasing, because I don't think it's lunatic. You're not a lunatic because you believe you're God. It's just a natural thing that humans experience all the time. Lots and lots and lots of people think they are God or have some connection to God. It's pretty common. So I don't see that as being a lunatic as any more than I see being religious as being a lunatic. It's just it's not a delusion because it isn't outside of the normal function of the human brain. It's just a normal kind of thing that humans experience due to how our brains work. Like you mentioned earlier, the fear of the unknown, type 1 and type 2 errors. If it's the rustle in the bushes and you think it's a lion, you run away and you survive. And if you think it's the wind, well, then you get eaten by the lion. So the people who ran away survived, and now our brains naturally see agency in everything. So I don't see that as particularly. I wouldn't call people a lunatic because they think they're God. I just see it as one of the strange conclusions people come up with that lead to all religions. I don't think the prophecies in the Bible are particularly accurate. I've talked with historians about that a number of times. I don't think it's the consensus in modern history is that you can't really assess the truth of those. They're too vague. I think that's what the consensus of most historians is right now. And you mentioned if a judge was looking at the evidence of the resurrection, what would he say? And that would be the same as the forensics guy and the abduction guy. You can't ever appeal to something that doesn't have a precedent. So saying if there is no body, if all these disciples thought that Jesus raised from the dead. Like I would agree they weren't lying. They actually believed this. But none of that would be evidence of an actual resurrection. That would just be evidence of you could only apply things we already know exist to explain that without novel testable predictions. Like if you actually confirm Jesus rose from the dead, that would be good evidence. So from the disciples' perspective, if they actually saw Jesus rise from the dead, that's pretty good evidence for them. They have a justified belief in their religious claims. But I don't think that we do just based on their testimony. So the judge could not conclude Jesus rose from the dead, or would not ever rule that Jesus rose from the dead, for the same reason the judge would not ever rule person X was killed by magic, or miracles, mythical creatures, paranormal, supernatural UFOs. None of those have precedent. So until we have testable predictions to confirm the miracles in general, or resurrection in general, then that couldn't ever be a conclusion that the judge could reach reasonably based on how law works.
Although there is, a logical fallacy we call argument to ignorance. This can't happen because it never happened. I mean, the resurrection is arguing that it is a unique thing, although it is also a foreshadowing of our own resurrection of the body, but that's coming at the end of the world. So it is a unique event. And what's so important about this, and I do agree partly with what you're saying, is that the disciples were actually reacting the way you're reacting now because they kept thinking he's a ghost. And because they went to what they knew or what they thought they knew. And Jesus said, no, touch me. I'm real. I have actually resurrected. And that's such a crazy idea, Tom, that there are many Christians, and maybe you've met them, who seem to think that when we die, we become angels, which of course is not in the Bible, not in Christianity. We will eventually have resurrection bodies like Jesus has, because we are not angels. We are enfleshed souls, fully physical and fully spiritual. And so we're talking about a unique event. And again, Jesus himself had to again and again show them, look, I'm eating, okay? I am physical in a way that is beyond what we can understand, but still physical, recognizable. And I do agree with you partly about the liar, lunatic Lord, and that is that if Jesus were a Hindu, the liar, lunatic Lord would fall apart, because many Hindus would say something like, well, of course I'm God, right? But Jesus is a Jew. Think of him today as a Muslim. He is in the most radically monotheistic religion of the day, where any suggestion of that is going to be the highest blasphemy. So the liar, lunatic Lord only works because Jesus is a Jew. And he himself would, again, from the Jewish point of view, what he said was blasphemy, the worst kind, unless he was the Son of God. And also, I've heard people suggest, and it sounds right at first, that, well, wait a minute, if you can use liar, lunatic Lord about Jesus, why can't you use it about Muhammad? Well, we really can't, because Muhammad, like Buddha and others, Socrates, whatever, Gandhi, their claim is not to be God. Their claim is that I heard from God. I'm giving you a message. And I would argue that in one way or another, all of us have probably thought we heard from God. And maybe we did, but maybe what God said to us was only for us and not for the rest of society. But Jesus made claims about himself. He didn't just make claims. He didn't, as you probably heard, he didn't say, I will show you the way. He said, I am the way, right? I won't lead you to the truth. I am the truth. I won't give you a way of achieving life. I am the life. I mean, these claims are, again, we can't domesticate Jesus. We can't just make him into a good rabbi. He didn't give us that option. He is one that's, in a sense, maybe lunatic is too strong, but deluded. And there are deluded people, like you said, who think they're God. But when people, I mean, it's just, when you read the Gospels, Jesus is just not a character you can invent. There is no character like this in literature or history. The closest is Aslan, because he is the Christ of Narnia, right? Who is this person who is so strong and direct, and yet can we find a sin in him? Can we find anything that is not holy and divine? People are, even people that don't believe in God generally respect Jesus and see him as a great teacher. But how can we call somebody a great teacher when he's making claims that are, blasphemous and beyond the pale? Again, to say that I forgive your sins, that would be like if somebody came into my room here and punched me in the face and filled me with blood, and you, Tom, looked at that guy and said, I forgive you. Well, that'd be ludicrous. You can't forgive him. The only person that can forgive him is me, because I'm the person that he hurt. Well, in sin, ultimately, the person that we are injuring, if we can use that word, is God. Only God can forgive sin. So this is an amazing claim. And again, it's a claim that calls for something of an either or. Either he is deceiving us or deceiving himself, maybe is a better way, or he is who he said he is, because he made claims about himself. And so I think it's a strong argument, and I think it's one that's based on the evidence, right? Evidence that is not, even the Gnostic Gospels, which come later, they just put sayings in Jesus's mouth, but they don't even try to go back and change it. They're not even historical in any real way. They're just groups of statements. I've read the Gospel of Philip and all that, Thomas. They're like, you can take out Jesus and put in Buddha, and it doesn't make a difference. They're just sayings. But the account of Jesus is a strong one, and the change in the disciples. And there's not just a change in the disciples, Tom. I mean, the resurrection, there's got to be something like the resurrection, because these Jews stopped worshiping on the Sabbath and started worshiping on Sunday. What would make them do that? They stopped sacrificing, and even before the temple was destroyed, they stopped sacrificing. What event would cause these Jews to completely change these things that define them if there wasn't an event? And again, I do understand what you're saying. You could argue that they were deluded, but this kind of mass delusion, and it's a delusion that they didn't make up, because Jesus had to convince them, no, I'm alive again.
Well, I don't see that as particularly special, because like people who claim they're Jesus, there's just a list from each century of about a dozen different people who claim to be Jesus or God in their particular religion, and they all had followers, and they all had changes to the doctrine of specific things they did. And I don't think that there must be an event for all of these different things to cause a group of people to believe in their particular variation of a religion. I mean, that just happens all the time. I don't think that because there's a big movement that indicates that there was some big event. It just means people are emotionally connected to certain ideas. Like on YouTube, people follow YouTubers not because they're really great YouTubers, they're just really popular, like the cat videos. It's not that the cat video is special, it's just people like it, and that's it. So I think that the same thing applies to all of the hundreds of people who have claimed to be Jesus or God. It doesn't mean that they're lunatics, even if in that religion it would be very strange who had that belief because it contradicts the foundational principles of the religion. It just means they're humans and they have different ideas about the religion, which is kind of common. So I don't think that would be evidence that what Jesus was saying was true in any sense, any more than it's evidence that all of the people who claim to be Jesus are true because they have followers and some event must have happened to cause them to change their belief system and the day they worship and the rituals that they do. I don't think it's particularly special. It just seems to be a common feature of humanity that people, when they believe something, they will change the way they act in accordance with their social connections in that group and whatever they think is important. So I don't see any of that as particularly good evidence. Even I grant that the apostles probably did believe what they were saying. I don't think mass delusion is necessarily the case. There's things called remorse delusions or something like that. I forget the exact term, where about 15% of the population, if someone you really loved or admired dies, you will see and hear them physically in everyday experiences. And that's a really common thing in human interaction. It's not necessarily a mass delusion. If you have a strong emotional connection to a person, you will often hear and see them after they die, but it's just a kind of delusion that we know happens in many, many humans, like 15% of the population. So especially in the case if it's someone you really revered, like a leader like Jesus was to the apostles, it seems really reasonable to think they would see him and hear his voice after he died. I don't see that would be particularly hard. And to see it in as a group, like we see Ouija boards, people see and experience things in Ouija boards or UFOs, and they all center in on a specific kind of explanation of that unknown event. And it's not really a mass delusion. It's just they saw something and they interpreted it to be this thing, and then all agreed upon the story afterward. Like when in criminal cases, when someone sees an event, they each have a unique interpretation of the event. But if they're all talking together, then they all come to some kind of agreed upon conclusion of what happened. So all of that seems to be perfectly well explained by just how human brains work and natural phenomenon that we see all the time. And you mentioned the blind man and the elephant analogy. Each one of the blind men, none of them actually predicted the elephant. They all said, this is this other thing that I'm predicting that has nothing to do with an elephant. How do you show that your description of Christianity as being the complete truth isn't just another one of those blind men saying, well, here's my interpretation of the elephant based on this small piece of the puzzle that I have.
It's because it's kind of weird to say this, but it's not something that we would have made up. And what I mean by that is basically every religion is a kind of karma. We're gaining our brownie points. We're doing this. We're going up the ladder. And like I said, even if the ladder takes 100 lives, it's still the basic idea. And this concept of grace, of God coming to us, of dying on our behalf, of rising again, this is something that we don't make up. And yet afterwards we recognize as true, or many people have recognized as true. It's just interesting. The argument you made before is a little bit similar to what Gamaliel, a famous rabbi, says in the book of Acts, when the other rabbis are so mad because the apostles are preaching the resurrection, and that's what they preach, it was the resurrection. And he said, leave these people alone, right? There was this guy, he rose up named Theudas, and he led a revolt, and then they were gone, and another one came, and he was gone. And so if this is not from God, it will just fall apart. But if it's from God, you will not be able to stop it, and you may even find yourself fighting against God. So we are looking at the results. We're looking at change lives. We're looking at, and it really upsets me, Tom, because at the core of Christianity is the concept of the testimony. I once was blind, but now I see. And unfortunately, that has been bastardized by 1,000 different infomercials about diet programs and breast inflation. I mean, they've sort of made it into a joke. Okay, but this concept is again very powerful. It is the change lives. What is this? It's got that twist of truth that fulfill. Again, it's so that Jesus doesn't contradict, but fulfills the law and prophets, the yearnings of the pagans, the desire. He fulfills it and brings it to completion or consummation. That's what I'm getting at with the concept of the only complete truth. So that the Magi, right, many think they were Zoroastrians, right? They were not Jews, they didn't have the Old Testament, but they followed their limited wisdom, and it led them to the Christ child. And when they got there, they could have said, forget this is ludicrous, I wasn't here for a baby, I'm going back, I'm never doing this again. But what the Magi say is, this is what I was searching for all my life. I never could have guessed it, but now that it's here, I recognize this is the truth. And they didn't just give them gifts, they worshiped the Christ child. So I'm saying that Christ is the only truth. He is the end point, the Magi. This is why Michelangelo paints the Sistine Chapel, and he puts all the Old Testament prophets, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Jeremiah, all these people. And then in between, he puts the Sibyls of Greece and Rome, the Oracle of Delphi, the Cumean Sibyl. He's putting them there because he's seeing them as sort of pagan prophetesses, that the hopes and fears of all the years are coming together in Bethlehem. I love what G.K. Chesterton says about it in The Everlasting Man. He says it's so important that not only the shepherds come to him, but the Magi come to him. And he says in the ancient world, when you look at it, you do have the pagans, right, who the sort of poor people, the common people who have this paganism, but they're not very philosophical. Then you have the philosophers, the Magi, who are philosophical, but not particularly theological. And somehow they're meeting together here at the Christ child. They're coming together because there are lots of non-religious ethical people, like ethical atheists like yourself. I'm expecting. Seem like a pretty good guy. But there's also lots of non-ethical religion, like paganism, that uses, ritual prostitution. But something happens at Mount Sinai when the God who thunders on the mountain also turns out to be the God who gives us the 10 Commandments. And again, at Christ, they're coming together and finding their culmination point. Because in some ways, there are two religions. There's Christianity and there's Hinduism. Everything else either leads up to Christianity, like Judaism, or away from Christianity, like Muslim, like Islam. And Hinduism, everything leads up to it or away from it. So which one of these, the sort of pantheism or this? And again, we look at those and see which has changed lives in a positive way, has changed the world? What has it done?
Sure. So there's a lot of things you mentioned there. One is the fulfills the desires of the that we have for the supernatural. Like, I mean, obviously, since we have those inclinations, it makes sense that we would actually make up stories to fulfill those desires rather than having some story fulfill them that is then evidence that it's true. It seems much more likely to go the other way around, that we have these desires and then make up stories that are not true to fulfill them. Um, and so when you say, like, mention the people that the prophets who came to Jesus and started to worship and said, "This is what I was searching for all my life." Well, that's pretty much what everyone claims about every one of their preferred religions. I don't think that measuring it based off of the amount of people who are changed by it or how it affects the world is a good criterion. For example, the fastest growing religion in human history was Falun Gong, and it's had the most positive impact on people in China. And it was also persecuted against, and people died for it, and all the things you normally mention about Christianity, but it's growing significantly faster than Christianity ever did. I don't think that any of those facts indicate its truth. Again, my criterion is if you want to show evidence that something is true, you need novel testable predictions. And I don't think that just people like something counts as evidence. It's people like lots of silly things. So I don't really think that counts. I mean, you keep mentioning the social psychology aspects of religion, but I don't think the social psychology counts as evidence of its truth because it's mostly just stuff in our head. Pretty much everything about social psychology, our motivations, our desires, all of those things are pretty much stuff in our head as far as we can tell. So why would any of those social psychology facts be indicative of Jesus? Because you mentioned that when I asked what indicates that you're not one of the blind men just touching the elephant and coming up with a story, you said he fulfills all of our desires. But I mean, that's essentially what all the blind men were doing. They were saying, here is how I feel the elephant. I'm going to fill in the blanks of my desires and put in my own idea. That doesn't seem to be good reason to conclude that your idea of the elephant is correct, would it?
I agree, but we're not just talking about individuals here. We're talking about the movement of history. We're talking about the Jews and the Gentiles and things moving towards this nodal point, moving sort of upwards towards. So what I'm saying is that it's not just one desire, but it's the desire of the nations, to use a phrase, that is reaching out and yearning, and it's an answer that we don't arrive on, but it's an answer that invades human history. I mean, maybe another way to put this is, a lot of people talk about how, miracles can't be true because they violate the laws of nature. Well, that is and isn't true. Okay, let's say that this is a expensive Ming Dynasty vase, right? If I pick it up and drop it, what will happen? Right? It will shatter. Why? Because of the law of gravity. Right? But look what happens here. Okay, I drop it, but my other hand comes in and grabs it. Right? Now I haven't broken the law of gravity. If I let this go, it'll drop again. I have added in outside information. And what we're saying is everybody that Jesus healed in Palestine eventually died. Right? Jesus, that the miracles don't violate the laws of nature. They are a moment where an outside hand reaches in and suspends the laws of nature. So what I'm getting at is again, it is not a breaking, but a fulfilling. Again, I go back to the first thing I said. I don't think any of us are comfortable in time. I don't think any of us are comfortable in space either. I would argue, kind of funny, but that one of the intimations of heaven is the remote control, because the remote control sort of gives us a 20-foot hand as if we were Mr. Fantastic. And I think we all feel like that we shouldn't be confined by time or space. And at some point, heaven will be outside of time and space, redeemed. So at one point, this will be fulfilled. And Jesus walking on the water is a sort of foreshadowing of what is to come. The resurrection itself is a foreshadowing. But again, most of the miracles that Jesus does are, to me, they're proof that the God who created nature is now in nature and nature is responding to him. But it's still not a violation. The virgin birth, God puts the seed in Mary, but as soon as the seed goes in Mary, then nature takes over. Mary carries Jesus for 9 months, gives birth to him in a normal way with blood and pain and everything like that. Again, sometimes we're not understanding what miracles are. They are showing us the real miracle that was there that we didn't notice. Because every day, water turns into wine. It takes a long, long time, right? When Jesus does it like that, we see that the God who created the laws of nature is in our midst. And again, about the same, not the same, pretty close. Within 50 years of the Gospels, Ovid's Metamorphosis was done. And that's full of miracles too, but those miracles violate everything. In fact, the only reason we can enjoy Greek mythology is because we know it isn't true. Because if it was true that people could turn into trees and rocks and ants and things like that, we would be terrified. But if the miracles of Jesus are true, then the God who created this world has entered into it and redeemed it. So again, the miracles of the Bible, the only reason we can see how different they are is by looking at them in their context, reading the other kinds of miracle accounts. There's another book called the Golden Ass. It's actually also called the Metamorphosis, but we call it the Golden Ass. It's about 100 years after the Gospels. But we see how different this is. This account is not just crazy myth, but it is a fulfillment of the God who created nature and its laws.
Well, I totally agree with you that miracles would not be a violation of the laws of nature. I think when Hume says that, what he means is that there's the laws of nature, which are unguided forces, and then you have a mind making guided forces, and it's one of the guided forces instead of the unguided forces. I think that's what he meant. But so I would agree that miracles would not violate anything. They're just an agent doing something as opposed to it being an unguided process. And so they're definitely possible. I see no problem with miracles being a possibility. And if the miracles in the Bible did happen, that would definitely make them unique from my perspective, because I don't think any miracles have ever happened. And so if you could, for example, demonstrate miracles today and say, here's a testable prediction, if miracles or if God is real, here's some experiment we could do to demonstrate miracles are real, just any miracles, then I think that would be good evidence to retroactively apply that evidence to what happened in the Bible and say, it's reasonable to believe these miracles happened because we can show miracles happen today. Just like if we discovered a unicorn in archaeology, it would be reasonable to infer unicorns existed at some point if we could find one today. But I don't think miracles have ever been demonstrated to actually be real in any sense. I think they're all, as far as we can tell, imaginary, which would make the miracle claims from the Bible not unique, because they're the same kind of imaginary claims that every other miracle claim was from every other religion, from my perspective.
Have you read a book called Miracles by Greg Keener?
Yep.
He's somebody you should get on the show, because he went out. Did you have him on the show?
No, I haven't had him on the show. I have invited him.
Because I read that and reviewed that book a long time ago. And again, he documents quite a lot of them. I mean, it'd be great to get him on and give his evidence account, but that these happen. Now, it is a little bit harder to talk about, quote, a controlled environment, simply because there's a difference between prayer and voodoo. Voodoo means that if you know the code or the spell or the chant, you can force God or the gods or the spirits or the ancestors to do it. Where prayer is always, God, if it be your will. So it's a little bit hard to do it in that sense. I mean, I got to admit, but I don't know. I mean, one place where you might see something like evidence is, despite the so-called separation of church and state, they allow Christian groups to go into prisons and do prison. And the reason they still allow it is because when it's a Christian group that does it, the recidivism rate goes way down. In other words, there seems to be a real change there. That may offer some kind of evidence, and obviously it does, because they still allow it, right? They wouldn't allow it if they couldn't, but it's like there's something about this that changes things. Maybe there's something to it. I've always found that amazing. Again, I wouldn't consider that proof, but I would consider it something like some kind of empirical evidence, I guess I would say.
Well, don't think of that for all religions. It's just freedom of religion. Any religious belief can do that, right? Especially if the prisoners ask for it.
Yeah.
But
I'm sure they try to keep it out of school as much as they can.
And yet,
for sure. Prison is allowed. I mean, it's just, I would just argue that it's because what the real religion of America is. The real religion of America is utilitarianism. That's the real religion of America, even for Christians. If it
I'd
were,
go for like monotonism or something like that. Just capitalism would be the religion of America.
yeah, that, and also
Materialism.
dualism.
Yeah.
This idea that it's so strange that we're, still in some ways a Christian country, but we still have this idea that spirit is good and body is bad, and that's simply not what Christianity is about. God physically raises from the dead. I remember how Chesterton once said, "I don't understand the critics of Christianity. They attack Christianity for saying that the body is bad and evil, and then they also get mad at the Christians because they persecuted the Gnostics." Well, the reason they persecuted the Gnostics was because the Gnostics taught that the body and flesh are inherently fallen. That's what Augustine was saved out of. Manichaeism and Gnosticism, saying that the body is naturally evil, the body is good, it's fallen, but all will be redeemed. And that's why, again, we have this weird notion of being angels when we die. But again, it's part of the creed, right? I believe in the resurrection of the dead. Eventually, we'll have a resurrection body like Jesus, but without any scars, right? This is pointing forward towards a fulfillment of humanity rather than a loss of humanity, because the Buddhist concept of heaven, moksha or nirvana, is the extinction of personality. It's not the perfection of becoming who God created us to be. It is the drop of water into the ocean, and now we're gone. It's kind of like the one soul that people like Emerson and some Americans, played with that idea, transcendentalism, even though, again, today it's more Eastern. But the West has also toyed with that idea of the loss of identity. But this concept that in heaven we will be ourselves and yet one with God is ultimately the same kind of mystery. And some have even compared it to, is light, what is it? Is light a particle or a beam, or whatever they say, right? Is it a wave or a particle? I'm saying it wrong. Again, is it possible that something can be two in one? And so is physics pointing towards at least the possibility of the so-called contradiction actually being a paradox that points towards a higher truth?
Sure, I would grant that. I'm not one to try and point out true logical contradictions. I think logical contradictions are mostly in how we understand something. But I did want to mention, like, Craig Keener. I've gone over that book with several people, like, 'cause it's brought up quite often in these debates. And the best examples people have are like the one where there is a person who had an NDE where they would raise above their body and they saw a serial number of a certain kind of a machine with a 12-digit something or another on the top of the machine. And I've gone through on each of these big examples people give, and we try to find the actual sources. And the source for that particular one, it comes from a professor, and it just stops with her testimony. We can't find any of the medical data. We can't find any of the doctors or the patient or even her claims about the machine. Serial numbers don't go on the top of machines. So all of these claims that I've investigated when going through Keener's work have turned out to be rather dubious in many ways, and we can't find the actual medical documentation to support the big ones. Like, all the small ones are pretty easy, but they're not really particularly phenomenal in any way. The book has been reviewed by a number of prominent neurologists, psychologists, and doctors, and there's only about like 5 of them that actually qualify as like really spectacular kinds of examples of miracles, and all of those are the ones that have the dubious sources that we can't find. So I'm not particularly compelled by Keener's book. It doesn't seem to have any great evidence other than these particular 5, which don't seem to have any evidential backing to them as far as we can find. So if you could give me find a doctoral source or the actual paper behind Keener's sources, I'd definitely be interested in finding those, because I haven't been able to find them for those big 5.
I mean, it all started with what was his name? Ron Moody, something Moody, that wrote Life After Life. And now, as I understand it, that was him talking. It was more anecdotal, but he started to notice how similar the stories were, even though these people didn't know each other. That was the beginning. And there's been another one. Actually, Eric Metaxas, who I'm friends with, has written some good stuff. He would be a good person to have on the show. I don't know if he has time. He's pretty busy.
Yeah. I've invited him too. I've not heard back yet.
Yeah, he's pretty busy. And he's stuck in his bunker anyway. But it's, I mean, I guess what I'm saying here, and why I believe I like apologetics, is that, there's this idea, some link it to Kierkegaard, that faith is a leap of faith. That to become a Christian, you come to the edge of the void. You just got to close your eyes and hold your nose and jump into it. And I would argue that Christianity doesn't have to be a leap of faith. It can be a step of faith. In other words, what I'm arguing here is that it makes sense. I think it's coherent. It's a coherent worldview. It has something to say on things. It does match the evidence. So I don't think it's illogical or irrational, but it does take a step of faith. It's sort of like a boy falls in love with a girl and he does all of his research and he finds out about her and her family and tries to find if she's compatible. And he might find all sorts of evidence that this could be a good answer, right? But there comes a moment of surrender where it is a step of faith and you just have to open your heart, because it does. I mean, it can't be 100% proven. I think it can be shown to be logical and rational and systematic and coherent. It's not just faith, but again, ultimately, you know what? Faith is not believing in something you know isn't true. The famous definition of faith in Hebrews, Hebrews 11, is the evidence of things not seen, the assurance of things hoped for. And it answers, I think, the deepest need. You know, that famous line from Augustine's Confessions, Lord, you've made us for yourselves, and our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. And later on, Pascal spoke of how we have a God-shaped vacuum and we try to fill it with everything. Good things like religion and good works and the arts and humanitarianism, and we try to fill it with bad things like whatever, promiscuity or drug addiction or anger or greed or whatever, but nothing quite fills that we've got this vacuum that is only filled by not religion, but God made man, the incarnate God. This is, I mean, one of the things that attracted me to Christianity is, again, how do I know I'm of value? How do I know I'm of worth? Right? And if God's going to answer it, he better come into it and don't give me this nonsense about you understand me. But if the incarnation is true, which is at the center of this, then God does understand because he has been us. And he didn't just agree to become man for 33 years. He is forever fully God and fully man because he's in a resurrection body. This is amazing. What it says is that not only are the prophecies of the Old Testament true, it says that in a weird way, the myths are true, not literally true, not historically true. But there was maybe one point in history when what was myth became true, became fact, came into the world. And the other thing, here you're talking about kind of hard on atheism. I want to say that the title of my book, Atheism on Trial, was invented by publishers, as it usually is. My original title was Nothing New Under the Sun. What I tried to show in that book is all of the arguments that the so-called new atheists are using are not new. They've been around for thousands of years, because the only thing that bothers me is that a lot of times the atheist, and you're not doing this, by the way, Tom, that the atheist comes forward and says, I've got all this new evidence in biology and history and chemistry and everything, and it proves that Christianity is wrong. And it's like, no, most of these arguments have been with us forever. And there have always been, and some of the greatest answers came from, quote, pagans like Plato and Aristotle and Cicero and other things like that. And basically what I'm saying is I'm trying to break the myth that says that we have evolved from everybody being, religious to everybody being atheist. That in fact, those options have always existed. Probably there are more atheists today than there were in the past, but that may just partly be social, and you're not going to get put in prison or something, Tom. And that they've existed side by side. And so what I'm saying is the evidence is there. The dialogue has been going on for a long time. And we need to engage that dialogue and see which has the better answer. And that's why I come on this show, because I believe that you're sincerely, you said at the very beginning, following the evidence wherever it led. And did you ever get to meet, before he died,
Carl Sagan?
The guy, what's his name?
Carl Sagan?
No, the guy who wrote the book, God is for Real. Well, the one that he didn't become a Christian, he became a theist. Oh my gosh, what was his name?
Yeah, the famous atheist who converted.
Yeah. Now again, he did not become a Christian. He became a theist.
Deist, I think. Right?
A deist. I can't believe the name's not coming to me.
Nope, I know what you're talking about.
I'll find it because it's in my book. Because I did get to meet him, not intimately.
Yeah, I never met him. I think I was a kid when he died.
He has died. He was up there. in age. But anyway, it was in my other book. But anyway, again, he didn't become a Christian. It was because of Aristotle's arguments and intelligent design and all that sort of stuff that he started to say, wait, there seems to be a need for an answer outside.
Anthony Flew.
Thank you, Anthony Flew. Yeah. Now again, he didn't, unless on his deathbed, he did not become a Christian, but he did become open to theism as an answer that seemed to explain the evidence better. And I got to hear him speak at this Ox thing called Oxbridge and whatnot. But what I'm saying is that it's still there. The debate is going on, and I do think that there's evidence. But again, what worldview best answers the evidence? What answers not only our mental questions, but our desires? And again, too often, it's not just the atheists, it's the Christians that want to separate reason and faith. And I don't think they can be arbitrarily. We are, again, we have again, the Latin phrase was
Sensus divinitatis.
Yeah, thank you for getting. We have a natural desire for these answers. Where does it come from? And it's just interesting. And I don't know if this kind of shocked you, Tom, but more and more philosophers used to be pretty much non-theistic, but lately, so much of philosophy has turned, if not to Christianity, at least to theism, partly because of Alvin Plantinga and people like that have sort of turned the tide and started opening themselves to at least theistic possibilities.
What do you mean by that? Because the recent polls I've looked at, the Phil Surveys paper shows that about 72-something% of philosophers are atheists right now. I think
it's great, but it just seems like more and more philosophy departments are growing, and we're seeing more people like Richard Swinburne and stuff. And it's again, it's there. Some of the books. I guess those are the two most famous, Plantinga and Swinburne. I don't know.
Well, the two most prestigious, the famous would be like William Lane Craig.
Yeah, William Lane Craig, that's true, would be best known and things like that. So anyway, oh my gosh. Oh, I have got a meeting at 2:00. Well, thank you so much.
Oh, do you have a time for just a few quick questions before you go?
What's that?
Do you have a time for just a few quick questions before you go? From
about 5 minutes, and I have a meeting I have to go to.
Sure. So Sully asks, would you prefer an atheist, or would God prefer an atheist who does good for the sake of doing good, or a theist who does good because he wants to be rewarded in the afterlife?
That is interesting, and that is one of Spinoza's sort of arguments that we should do it. And I would just, I guess my response would be that true Christianity, grace, is what is the phrase that salvation is by faith, but we're saved to do good works. So if we're doing good works to earn God's merit, we're going to end up like the younger Luther, who drove himself absolutely insane doing penance again and again and again and again and again. But it is, I mean, I guess because I'm a professor, it would be like me saying to my students, you all have A's. Now I want you to study out of love, right? And that's certainly what God prefers. And an honest atheist is someone who is willing to follow, but willing to follow wherever it leads, even if it leads to God, and even if it leads to a kind of accountability. Because I think all of us would love to be a sort of pantheist. And what I mean by that is, it's wonderful when the world is wonderful and it's nice outside and it's sunny. It's nice to be able to believe there's more than just what I see. But when we want to do something really bad, whatever it happens to be, it would be nice to know that the universe doesn't care. Right? So yes, I do think that God reaches out to somebody like Paul, right? But a true seeker is someone who says, let me truly follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it is to a personal God. Not someone who says, all right, give me the evidence so I can find a way around it. I guess the best example is when you talk to people and they say, the Bible doesn't say Jesus is God, and you kind of go through it and you show all those places. And then when they're done, they say, well, how do you know that's true? It's sort of like, do you want it to be real? Because if it's real, what does it mean? It means, first of all, that there really is a God, not a eternal mind, not the God part of my brain, like that James guy said. That was a cool book, The Bicameral Mind. That there really is a God, and that he actually loves us and has come into the world and done it for us. I mean, like I said, to me, if it's true, everything's different. If it's not, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then hey, religion is religion. That's cool. I will tell you, Tom, that if it could be proved that Jesus didn't raise from the dead, I would become a Stoic. I think that's the most manly option. And I would be a Stoic because I'm a Westerner. If I was an Easterner, I would become a Buddhist, because I really believe ultimately Buddhism and Stoicism are very much the same. It's basically, and maybe it's what you're doing, Tom. You look to me like a guy that's like, hey, I'm just going to mind my own business, and I'm not going to hurt anybody, and I'm not going to rob anybody, and I'm not going to sleep with anybody's wife, okay? I'm going to live a basically moral life. And again, I really do think that's why, what's his name? Marcus Aurelius. I'm a big fan. That was the last chapter of my atheism book. I'm a big fan of Stoicism. But if there's something more than just playing it safe, if in fact there is a heaven that's not just a reward, but a heaven that will allow us to become what God created us to be, I just don't want to miss that. Okay, basically.
Well, actually, one last question, if you have time, is Michael asked, how would you reconcile Mark 10:18, where Jesus says, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God"?
I think it's because this man has actually perceived something. It's like, what do you mean by that? Do you just mean what everybody else means? Or are you recognizing something in me? And he reaches out to that person. And I don't think he calls everybody to give away all their wealth, but he saw that for that man, his wealth was his idol. It was the thing keeping him away from God. I think basically it's sort of like when Pontius Pilate says to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he says, "Who told you that?" Right? If it was the Romans who said it, he's like, "No, I'm not the king of the Jews the way you think of it, as a potential threat who's going to overthrow it. But if you're hearing it from the Pharisees, then yeah, I'm the king of the Jews in the sense that I'm the Messiah, but I'm not the political Messiah, basically." So I do think, in the context, there's some truth to that.
Awesome. Well, thanks. I'll let you get to your meeting.
Thank you, Tom. I'm sorry, I really do have to get to a meeting. Otherwise, I'd stay all day. But thank you, Tom, and blessings to you. And keep up the work.
Yeah, I really
Thanks
enjoyed talking to you. See you later.